Hello, we're going to start today's lesson with a quick six. You know the drill. Open your books, answer these 6 questions, and then we'll go through them. Press pause. Okay, so number 1, when was the first Divorce Reform Act and what did it do? So that was in 1969, and essentially what it did was make divorce easier. You no longer had to say that your marriage had broken down because of cruelty or adultery, for example. It could now break down because of irretrievable breakdown. In other words, you're just simply not getting along. What is a boomerang child? A boomerang child is one who leaves the family home and comes back, much like a boomerang. So they might go off to university, and when they finish university, come back to live at home, or they might go off to live in somebody that they're in a relationship with, and then they might come home because that relationship might break down, for example. A representative study is where you make sure that the group that you sample, the group that you choose to study, are representative of the whole. So, for example, if I wanted to ask Year 9 about their attitudes to independent learning, and I couldn't interview all of Year 9, I might instead want to talk to 50 of them. And I'd need to make sure that those 50 weren't, for example, all boys, or all girls, or all top set children. And in fact, instead, it was a good sample. So 50% boys, 50% girls, perhaps a quarter who were in the top set of 4 sets, so that it represents the entire cohort. What is a mixed method approach? So that's where you look at 2 different research methods when you do your piece of research. So for example, you might do some observation and you might follow that up with some interviews. How is class measured in schools today? So that was last lesson. We talked about free school meals and the fact that working class is measured by whether the child is in receipt of free school meals. And we called that also disadvantaged children. And what are some of the issues with using this method of class? Of course, unfortunately, it doesn't pick up all the children who are disadvantaged. Some of them that get free school meals, in fact, actually are relatively well off financially. And also some of those who don't get free school meals probably should do, and therefore are in that class of children who find things a little bit more tricky. So let's move on to today's topic. So before we go further into today's lesson, we need to think about culture, and we need to just remind ourselves what we mean by culture. So remember, it is the way of living of a particular group of people. So thinking about their norms, their values, their language, their customs, and their agents of socialisation, how they are socialised into the appropriate way of life for their particular culture. So title for today's lesson: how do class cultures affect attainment in schools? So we're looking at culture today and how it affects how well children do. Put that into your books with a title and a date. So on the next slides, there are 3 what are known to be cultural factors: language, values, and parental expectations. And what I want you to do is I want you to draw a table in your books like the one that's there in the blue, with the 3 headings. The cultural factor is one of the headings. Why it is important, why that factor is important to allow people to be successful, and why does that factor benefit the middle class more. Look at the factors and add the information and the examples. And after you've done that, I want you to have a think. Who is to blame for that failure? If it means that people don't do as well, is that the school's fault or the family's fault? So we'll read them over together. They're on the slides, and then you need to fill in your table. Language skills. Children need language skills to succeed in education. They'll need a wide vocabulary in school to understand teachers, textbooks and exams, and also to have discussions in class. Without these skills, they may fall behind. Middle-class families seem to be able to know a wider vocabulary because middle-class homes have more books, or maybe even more space for books. Middle-class parents are more likely to spend more time reading to their children, which puts middle-class students ahead of the game with language. So you'll go back to your table and fill in those columns and just say whether you think also this lack of language skill for working class is their fault or the fault of the school. Values. Some children see education as important, whereas other children don't value school at all. Those that see it as important say it helps them have a good future, jobs, lifestyle, etc. And so they will pay attention, they'll do their homework and they'll work hard to be successful. Different classes have different values and children are socialised into these values from a young age. There's evidence from the 1960s and 70s that suggests working class children failed in school because their parents raised them in a culture where education wasn't important, unlike the middle class children who were raised to believe education was incredibly important. Again, fill in your table and just jot down whether you think that this lack of the correct values is the fault of the school or the family. And let's look at parental involvement. Success in school is also down to how involved parents are with their child's learning and how much support they offer. If children have parental support, they are likely to be pushed more to be successful and not fall behind. Evidence from the 1960s and 70s claimed that working class children failed due to language and values and parents not being involved because it wasn't important in their culture. However, this evidence has been criticised because it puts too much blame on the parents and ignores other factors like the schools themselves. It's clear, though, the middle class are more likely to have time to be more involved in education than working class parents. So let's just have a little look at this idea of cultural capital. So cultural capital is a very important concept in sociology for you to have a look at this moment. And it was put together by this guy called Pierre Bourdieu. He was a Marxist sociologist. So you do need to jot down some of the bits that are going to be in this yellow box. So importantly, Pierre Bourdieu is a Marxist. He said middle class students have more cultural capital than working class students. And what he meant by that is that cultural capital was having skills and interests in art and literature and books and theatre and so on. So we know that capital is what you've got that you can invest. So in terms of money, if you were starting up a business, your capital is the money you invest in your company. And cultural capital is this idea of what you've got as your starting point, really, as a student of education in terms of culture. So in a middle class family, the expectation is often that these children spend some of their school holidays and weekends going to museums, and they have theatre trips, and they go up to maybe go to London and look around, go out of Portsmouth in terms of our children, and see the world around them. And that gives them what's called this cultural capital. They read books, they learn about current affairs. And as a result, they've then got the skills and interests that fit in with the skills and interests of the school, and they see themselves a little bit superior. And schools are more likely to cover these interests rather than working class ones, so therefore the middle class are more likely to be successful. Really importantly, Bourdieu doesn't blame the working class for this. He doesn't say that the working class families are bad because they don't take their children to theatres or on holidays and so on. What he actually says is it's the schools that are in the wrong, because the schools are set up to support the middle classes. And the language used in schools and the books that they study and the things that they talk about support the middle class more than they support the working class. And that's a really important distinction for you to understand. He is saying that the working class lack cultural capital, but he is saying the fault that they therefore do less well in school is the school's fault and not actually the family themselves' fault, because it's just that their culture doesn't mix properly, it doesn't match the school culture. So have a think about our school, have a think about Admiral Lord Nelson, and think about which bits of it do you think are more middle class, perhaps, the things that I've not already mentioned, than working class. Some of the other things you might think about. So we've looked at cultural capital. The next aspect in terms of success at school is social capital. And this was put forward by two sociologists called Diane Ray and Becky Francis fairly recently in terms of what we normally look at in 1998. And their study, what they looked at was they said that working class and middle class mothers are different in how well they understand the school system, and they found that middle class mothers understand it better and they understand better how to help their children. And it wasn't, they put aside this idea that working class parents don't want their children to do well. So what was thought before, as I said to you earlier, was that working class families don't value education, they don't think it's important. They said, no, that's not true. What they said was true was that working class parents did want their children to do well. It was important to them, but they didn't know how to help them. And they said also that middle class parents have links with other people to help their children be successful. So the social circles that middle class parents hang out in, if you like, also understand school, and they can have conversations together on how best to help their children. It's this idea of that it's not about what you know, it's about who you know. So therefore, middle class families, as well as having more cultural capital, they've also got, Diane Ray and Becky Francis say, more social capital and know more about how to be successful. Now, Diane Ray and Becky Francis, really importantly, are feminists. So have a think, layer on top of this, what they're for that tells you about gender and school. Have a think about that. So finally, I just want you to think about, if the student fails, who are you thinking is to blame? Is the student to blame? Is the school to blame? Are the parents to blame? Or is it a mix of all? And in which case, which bits, why and when? Have a little think about that. You could do this as a little three-way Venn diagram if you liked. 3 circles, student, school, and then parents. And then see if you can think about which aspects are which bits are to blame for which aspects. Have a little go. We're going to finish with an 8-marker exam question. So remember, 8 marks, 8 minutes. You need to mention 2 factors, explain them in detail. And your question is, explain how cultural factors can impact on education achievement. Achievement, remember, is the same word really as attainment. So you can, in your heads, think of either thing there. Good luck. See you soon.